So last week we looked at I would say, a fairly troubling case involving an engineer who detected what he thought was a serious problem in the design of a medical respirator. And although the Board of Ethical Review thought that the engineer was appropriate to have that concern and to act on that concern, they judged that the way that he dealt with it lacked discretion, and that is, he dealt with it the wrong way. He responded, or he acted on his concern in the wrong way, giving an ultimatum to his employer, and that the actual act of giving that ultimatum, that is, either you take prompt action on this thing or I'm going to a federal regulatory agency, that constituted an unethical act. I'm not saying that was wrong, but it raises certain troubling questions, doesn't it? And it's a sort of classic first canon case where the engineer fears for the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and then has to decide how to act most appropriately on that concern or fear for the safety. This week's case is also a first canon case. That is, if we look at the references here, we see the first reference is to the first canon: engineers, in the fulfillment of their professional duties, shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Much different circumstances. Here are the facts. We have an engineer, and imagine a civil engineer. Performs construction observation services on a project. During the performance of the construction observation services, observes potential safety issues on a project on an adjacent property. That is, you're an engineer, you're there to observe, right? Make sure that everything's safe. And you observe an issue on another site, an adjacent site, with a different client that you're not involved with, but you see something that concerns you. And then the question is, what are your ethical obligations under those circumstances? Also interesting case, because the complication here, there were complications last week. There were questions about the engineer's competence to make a judgment in the field. There are questions about whether the engineer should or shouldn't be satisfied with his employer's assertion that the matter was being looked into, things like that. The complicated things here, obviously, the complication is that the safety issue is not on the site that you're actually employed to work on, not your direct responsibility. And really, it raises a very interesting question. If you see a safety issue on the job that you're working on, clearly you have an ethical obligation to do something. If you see a safety issue on a job that you're not involved with, but it's a matter that should be of concern, do you have any obligations? So it raises that issue. That is, in the course of my professional life, I know that jobs that I'm working on, projects that I'm working on, I have a certain ethical obligation to ensure the public's health, safety, and welfare. What if I observe something that I'm not working on, but I know, because I'm an engineer, I know that there is probably a problem, or I think that there's a problem? Do I have any ethical obligations there? So it's a very interesting case in that respect, because it really brings up the question of the scope of your first canon duties as an engineer. I won't go through the whole case. That's your job. But there's a really interesting, one of the reasons I really like this case is there's a really interesting statement here. I guess it's on page 3. After looking at previous cases that also, were similar, again, this analogical reasoning that they do, looking at precedent, it was wonderful statement here. Now, whether or not it's right, I'm not sure, but it's very revealing. Right here, page 3, as a general rule, an engineer cannot be expected to take on personal or professional responsibility for each and every potential health and safety risk they may be exposed to during the course of a day, which are essentially unrelated to the services for which the engineer is being professionally engaged. To impose such a responsibility upon an engineer could thrust the engineer into a never ending scope of activities that are beyond what is reasonable and could expose the engineer to unlimited personal and professional liability. That is what I mean, clearly, they have a certain conclusion here. They do think that the engineer has certain responsibilities or duties in this case, but they're very keen on putting a limit on what those duties are, because to say that you have an ethical responsibility to do something about a project where you sort of casually observe a safety problem would be a slippery slope. It would be what other cliches can we use? A Pandora's box, or it would be opening things up to a level of responsibility which they say is unreasonable. That is, the engineer cannot be ethically bound to do something about every safety problem that they observe in their lives. That would be unreasonable. It would be an unreasonable burden. They can be expected, and they are expected to be concerned with safety problems, threats to public safety for projects that they are directly engaged in, but not projects at large that they may observe problems at. That's an interesting, I'm not saying it's right, but it's an interesting claim. And as I said before, they're very keen on putting a limit to first canon responsibilities, to say that the engineer cannot be expected to take professional responsibility for everything they observe. Now, I don't know if I agree with that. I'm not sure that. I mean, it's certainly a plausible proposition, and I can see why they would want to put a lid on the level of responsibility. But it's not immediately clear to me that that's the proper reading of this first canon. One of the things I can definitely say factually about this first canon is that it says what it says. That is, it says engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. It doesn't say they shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public only insofar as they are affected by the projects that they are personally involved in. So, I mean, whether the board has properly interpreted and applied the first canon in this case, I don't know. They're not obviously wrong in my mind, but they're certainly they're not really obviously right either.